The letter arrived on a Tuesday, dog-eared and smelling faintly of cedar, and by the time Clayton Maddox had read only 3/4 of it, he was already pulling his saddle off the peg on the barn wall. It was the summer of 1878, and the Wyoming Territory was the kind of place where a man could ride for 2 days without seeing another soul, where the sky pressed down on the plains like a heavy wool blanket, and where the wind carried the scent of sage and something older than memory. Clayton Maddox was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders, and possessed of the kind of quiet that most people mistook for stupidity until he opened his mouth and said something that cut straight to the bone of a matter. He ran a cattle operation outside of Laramie that he had built himself from nothing, from $200 and a borrowed gelding and 5 years of work that had left permanent calluses on his palms and a particular stillness behind his eyes that came from knowing hard days and surviving them. He had not been looking for a wife. That was the truth of it, and he would have told anyone who asked as much. His neighbor, a well-meaning and perpetually optimistic rancher named Theodore Greer, had been the one to suggest it, had been the one to correspond with a matchmaking service out of St. Louis, had even been the one to describe Clayton's property, his acreage, and his financial standing in flattering but essentially accurate terms. Clayton had tolerated this with the same patience he applied to most things that were outside his control, which was to say that he had not actively opposed it, and had let the letters go out under the understanding that nothing would likely come of it. And then Theodore had come over on that particular Tuesday morning, red-faced and grinning, waving the letter from St. Louis, and he had handed it to Clayton at the kitchen table with the expression of a man presenting a gift he was very proud of. Clayton had poured himself a second cup of coffee and begun to read. The letter was from a Mrs. Hartwell of the Hartwell Correspondence Agency of St. Louis, Missouri, and it was professionally written in the cramped, precise script of a woman who had spent decades arranging marriages across enormous distances and had learned to convey a great deal of information in measured, careful language. Mrs. Hartwell described the candidate, one Miss Eliza Winslow, age 26, late of Abilene, Kansas, and before that of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She had been educated at a modest seminary in the East before circumstances had brought her west following the death of both her parents in the winter of 1875. She was reported to be skilled in household management, competent with livestock, literate, and in good health. Then came the sentences that made Clayton pause. Mrs. Hartwell noted, with the particular diplomatic care of someone who had learned that honesty was ultimately more useful than flattery in these arrangements, that Miss Winslow had previously corresponded with 3 gentlemen through the agency, and that none of those correspondences had resulted in a match. She attributed this to Miss Winslow's, and here the language became delicate, independent nature and strong personal convictions. She noted that several previous correspondents had described the woman as proud. One had used the word difficult, and Mrs. Hartwell had chosen to include this observation because she believed in full disclosure, though she added in the same sentence that she personally believed these qualities spoke to a woman of considerable character and backbone, and that the right sort of man would find them assets rather than liabilities. Clayton sat with that for a moment. Proud and difficult. He thought about what it meant for a woman to be described that way. He thought about what it meant for a woman to be 26 years old, educated, and alone in Abilene, Kansas, in 1878, having buried both her parents in the same winter and having come west not because she wanted to, but because she had no other options. He thought about how much spine it must have taken to keep herself upright through all of that, and how a woman who had survived those things without crumbling might very well look proud to someone who did not understand the cost of that survival, and difficult to someone who expected her to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention came her way. He had read as far as the description of her eyes, which Mrs. Hartwell noted were a striking shade of gray-green, when he set the letter down on the table, pushed back his chair, and walked out to the barn. Theodore found him there a few minutes later, standing with the saddle in his hands. "You haven't finished reading it," Theodore said. "Read enough," Clayton said. "You can't be riding somewhere. You only just got the letter." Clayton threw the saddle over his horse's back, a big bay gelding named Conductor who had the temperament of a philosopher and the stamina of something born to run. He reached under the horse's belly for the cinch strap and pulled it through with the practiced efficiency of a man who had saddled more horses than he could count. "I'm not riding somewhere," he said. "I'm riding to the telegraph office." Theodore blinked. "To do what?" "To send a message to this Mrs. Hartwell." He patted Conductor's neck and turned to look at his neighbor with the expression he reserved for things he had already decided. "To tell her I'd like to write to Miss Winslow directly." Theodore opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had known Clayton Maddox for 6 years, and in those 6 years he had learned that when the man had that particular look on his face, conversation was largely decorative. "You didn't even finish the letter," Theodore said. "I didn't need to." And that was how it began. The first letter Clayton wrote to Eliza Winslow took him 4 drafts and most of one evening, which was more revision than he had applied to anything since the business contracts he had signed when purchasing the eastern third of his acreage in 1875. He was not a man who second-guessed himself as a rule, but he found that writing to her felt different from other kinds of communication, felt like a thing that deserved care. He was direct by nature, and he did not want to be otherwise, but he also did not want to be coarse or presumptuous. He wrote that he had read Mrs. Hartwell's letter and that he was not troubled by what it contained. He wrote that he ran a cattle operation of some 340 acres outside of Laramie, and that he was comfortable but not wealthy, that the house was solid, and had a good stove and a well that had never run dry in 5 years. He wrote that he was not looking for someone to agree with him on everything, and that, in his experience, a person who challenged you to think harder was more valuable company than one who did not. He wrote that he hoped she would write back, and that if she chose not to, he would understand. He read it over one more time, crossed out the last sentence because it felt too much like giving her an easy exit before she had even decided whether she wanted one, and sent it off. 3 weeks passed. He did not hear from her. He told himself this was fine. He had said he would understand. He did understand in the intellectual sense. In the practical sense, he found himself checking with the postmaster more frequently than usual, and he was not a man who paid much attention to mail under ordinary circumstances. On the 24th day, her letter arrived. He had been out mending fence on the north pasture when his ranch hand, a young man named Denny Alcott, who was 19 and possessed of boundless energy and very little tact, came riding out to find him with the letter tucked into his shirt pocket. "Letter for you," Denny said, pulling it out and holding it at arm's length as though it might be dangerous. "From Kansas." Clayton set down his fencing tool and took the envelope. The handwriting on the outside was precise and bold, with none of the backward-tilting uncertainty that sometimes crept into a person's script when they were unsure of themselves. She wrote her return address clearly, as if daring the letter to be lost. He opened it standing there in the sun, with the smell of dry grass and warm earth all around him, and Conductor drowsing in the shade of the lone cottonwood 50 yards off. Miss Eliza Winslow wrote in complete sentences and without excessive ornamentation. She acknowledged his letter and said she had found it interesting primarily because it did not read like the other letters she had received through the agency, which had tended, she noted, to treat her as a piece of furniture being evaluated for utility. She said she was not interested in being anyone's useful piece of furniture. She said she had read his letter 3 times, which she had not done with the others, and that she was willing to correspond further on the condition that he not suddenly transform into a different sort of man after she expressed interest, which she had observed was a tendency in some correspondence when the balance of power shifted. Clayton read that twice. He stood in the north pasture in the July heat, with the fence post half driven and the letter in his hand, and he felt something he had not expected to feel from reading words on paper, which was the distinct and inconvenient sensation of being entirely charmed. He folded the letter carefully, tucked it into his breast pocket, picked up the fencing tool, and finished the post before riding back to the house to reply. The letters that followed came every 2 weeks or so, sometimes faster, and each one was more candid than the last. She told him about Abilene, about the small boarding house where she rented a room from a widow named Mrs. Cook, about the work she had taken in as a seamstress to supplement the modest inheritance that had kept her from destitution after her parents died. She told him about Philadelphia, about the seminary and the books she had loved, and the ones she had found pretentious, about her father who had been a printer, and had taught her to love language, and her mother who had been quietly formidable, and had taught her to love competence. She told him that she had come west with her parents because her father had believed in the promise of the frontier, and had died of a fever before he could collect on any of it. She told him that she was proud, and that she was aware she was proud, and that she did not intend to apologize for it. He wrote back that he respected the self-awareness and that he had no interest in apologies. She told him that she had a tendency to speak her mind even when it was inconvenient, and that she had been told this was unbecoming. He wrote back that he had been told he was stubborn, and that the two qualities probably deserved each other. There was a pause of nearly a week after that letter before her response came, and when it did, it was shorter than usual and contained only 3 sentences that he read so many times the paper softened along the fold lines. She wrote that she found him consistently surprising. She wrote that she was beginning to believe he might be honest. She wrote that she was going to need some time to decide what to do with that. He wrote back immediately, which was not his usual practice, because he could not help himself. He wrote that she should take all the time she needed and that he would be here. Over the next 2 months, through the heat of Wyoming summer and into the dry gold of early autumn, they wrote about everything. They wrote about politics and found themselves in agreement on things that mattered and disagreement on things that were interesting. They wrote about the land, and he told her about the particular color of the sky over the Laramie Plains in October, and she told him about the dust of Abilene, and how she had never quite gotten used to the flatness after Philadelphia's rooftops and hills. They wrote about books, and he surprised her. He could tell from the shift in her tone, by having read more than she expected, because the assumption people made about men who worked cattle was apparently that they did not read, and he had long since stopped bothering to correct this assumption in anyone he did not intend to keep in his life. He was beginning to understand, through the accumulation of her words over those weeks, that she was brilliant and wary and fiercely loyal to the people she had decided deserved it, and that getting herself onto that list was a thing you had to earn and not a thing you could ask for. He understood this because he was built along similar lines, and because he recognized the architecture of a person who had learned that trusting freely cost more than they could afford. In October, he wrote to ask if she would consider coming to Laramie. Not to marry him immediately, he clarified, because he understood she would not want to come out here and find herself in a situation she could not walk away from. He had spoken with a woman in town, a Mrs. Agnes Porter, who ran a respectable boarding house on the main street of Laramie, and he had arranged for a room to be held for Miss Winslow at his expense, with no expectation attached, so that she could come and see the place and meet him in person and make whatever decision she felt was right. He said he would not pressure her. He said he thought she deserved to make a choice she could live with. Her answer took 3 weeks, and when it arrived it was a single page. She wrote that she was coming on the 15th of November on the westbound train. She wrote that she was not promising anything. He wrote back that he was not asking her to. He cleaned the house twice before the 15th. He would have died before admitting this to Theodore, but he did it anyway, pulling the curtains down and washing them and beating the rugs and scrubbing the kitchen floor, and making sure the good lamp in the front room had a new wick. He bought a second rocking chair for the porch because he thought there should be one for her, and then felt embarrassed about the assumption, and moved it inside to the sitting room where it looked like it might have always been there. Denny noticed the general state of elevated housekeeping and made no comment, which was the most tactful thing the young man had ever done, and Clayton was grateful for it. On the morning of the 15th, he drove the wagon into Laramie and tied it outside the train station, and stood on the platform in his good jacket with his hat in his hands and waited. The train was 40 minutes late, which was not unusual for the Union Pacific Line in November when the wind came down off the mountains and pushed against everything, and he stood there for those 40 minutes and did not once check his pocket watch more than 8 or 10 times. The train arrived at last with the usual noise and steam, and the shuffling disembarkation of passengers who had been sitting for days and were stiff in the legs and eager for solid ground. He watched the door of the passenger car. She stepped down with a traveling bag in one hand and a trunk being carried behind her by the porter, and she was nothing like the vague impression he had assembled from letters and Mrs. Hartwell's careful descriptions, and she was exactly like her. She was tall for a woman, with good posture that had the quality of a decision rather than an accident, and her hair was dark and pinned severely in the way of someone who put practicality above sentiment in the morning. Her coat was navy blue and well-maintained, her boots were sensible, and her eyes, when they found him standing there with his hat in his hands, were precisely the gray-green that Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned, and they were not soft eyes. They were eyes that looked at things directly and without flinching, and they looked at him that way now, taking him in with the same deliberate thoroughness he imagined she applied to any situation she was not yet sure of. He walked toward her. She stood her ground and let him come to her, which told him something. "Miss Winslow," he said. "Mr. Maddox," she said. Her voice was clear and a little lower than he had imagined, with the remnants of Eastern vowels rounded at the edges by years of Kansas. She had a composure about her that was not coldness exactly, but was the careful management of a person who had been burned before and intended to be cautious this time. "I have the wagon outside," he said. "I'll take your trunk to Mrs. Porter's boarding house first. She's expecting you." "I know. I received her letter." She picked up her traveling bag when he moved to take it, which was not a rebuff so much as a statement, and he let her have it without argument. They walked out to the wagon in the clear, cold November air, and he helped her up onto the seat because the step was high, and she accepted the help without comment, which seemed like a reasonable equilibrium to start with. He drove through the town slowly, pointing out the general store and the doctor's office, and the post office where their letters had gone back and forth for 4 months, and she looked at everything with those attentive gray-green eyes and asked 1 or 2 questions that were sharp and specific and demonstrated that she had already done considerable thinking about what life in Laramie would actually involve. He dropped her at Mrs. Porter's boarding house, carried her trunk up to the door himself despite the trunk being objectively very heavy, and her looking like she might have managed it on principle if he had not moved first, and he told her he would come by the following morning at 10 o'clock if she was agreeable, to show her the property, and that if she was not agreeable she could send word and he would adjust his plans without difficulty. She looked at him for a moment with that direct, measuring look. 10 o'clock, she said. "I'll be ready." He drove back to the ranch in the dark with the cold coming down off the mountains, and the stars very sharp and close overhead, and he sat in his kitchen for a while with the lamp lit and a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, and he thought about the way she had looked at him on that platform, like she was deciding whether to be disappointed or surprised, and how by the time they had reached the wagon it had seemed to be tipping toward surprise. He slept better that night than he had in months. She arrived the next morning at 5 minutes before 10, which told him she was punctual, and also that she had probably been ready since 9. He met her at the end of the drive and they walked the property together in the cold, clear light of a Wyoming November morning, and he showed her the barn and the pastures and the house, and she looked at everything the same way she had looked at him, with complete attention and without any pretense. Inside the house, she stood in the kitchen for a long time with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at the stove and the window over the sink that looked out toward the mountains. "You clean your own house," she said. It was not a question. He supposed it was evident in the particular way the curtains hung, recently washed, or in the scrubbed floor. "I do," he said. "The other men Mrs. Hartwell corresponded with on my behalf described their households as requiring management," she said, by which they meant they needed someone to manage the household for them while they did other things. "I can manage my own household," he said. "I'm not looking for someone to do my work. I'm looking for a person." She turned away from the window and looked at him. "What does that mean, exactly?" she said. He thought about how to answer that honestly. He had been thinking about it, off and on, since October, since he had decided to write and ask her to come. "It means I've been doing fine by myself," he said, "but fine is not the same thing as good. And I think there's a difference between a life that works and a life that has someone in it worth building it with. I think you might be that person. I'm not certain yet. You're not certain either. That's why you're here and not at the altar." She was quiet for a moment. "You are remarkably straightforward," she said. "I've found it saves time," he said. Something shifted in her face. It was not quite a smile, but it was the precursor to one, the moment before the defenses decided whether to hold or to ease a fraction. "Show me the rest," she said. He showed her the rest. He showed her the eastern pasture and the creek that ran along the southern edge of the property and did not freeze solid even in the worst winters. He showed her the vegetable garden that he had put in 3 years ago and maintained with more stubbornness than skill. He showed her the corner of the sitting room where there was a bookshelf with 27 books on it, and he watched her cross to it and read the spines without comment, and he watched her pull one out and open it and read a page. "You've read this one," she said. It was a George Eliot novel, worn at the spine. "Twice," he said. She put it back very carefully, which was how you treated a book you thought deserved respect. She looked at him over her shoulder. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly," she said. "I generally do," he said. "The last man Mrs. Hartwell matched me with told me in his letters that he valued independence in a woman," she said. "And then when I arrived at his property in Missouri, it became very clear that what he valued was the idea of independence as something admirable in theory, not as something he was prepared to actually live alongside. He wanted a wife who was interesting to talk about but manageable to live with." She paused. "Are you that man?" Clayton considered her very carefully. She was standing in his sitting room in the gray November light with her coat still on and her chin lifted at the precise angle of a woman who had been disappointed before and was asking the question anyway because she had decided it was worth asking. "No," he said, "I'm not, but I would also tell you that there's no way to prove that in a conversation. You'd have to decide based on everything else." "I know," she said. "I am." She stayed in Laramie. She stayed at Mrs. Porter's boarding house, and she and Clayton Maddox saw each other 4 days out of 7, which was a pace that felt right to both of them. That gave her time to know the town and know her own mind, and not feel as though she had walked into something she could not step back from. He took her to the general store and introduced her to people without hovering over the introductions or managing what she said, which she noticed. He took her to the doctor's office because she had expressed an interest in knowing where it was, practically speaking, and the doctor, a direct and competent man named Dr. Samuel Hale, shook her hand like a person rather than presenting his hand awkwardly as though unsure whether she was the sort of woman who shook hands, which she also noticed. On the 3rd week of November, they sat on the porch of the ranch house in the cold with blankets over their laps and 2 cups of coffee going warm between them, and they talked for 4 hours about everything and nothing, about the future of the cattle industry and the construction of the transcontinental railroad and what it was doing to the West, about the books they had both read and the ones she had loved that he had not read and the ones he had loved that she had not. She told him things about Philadelphia she had not put in the letters, things about the particular light in autumn and the smell of the printing shop where her father worked, and how she had sat in that shop as a child and learned to read with the smell of ink all around her. He told her about coming to Wyoming at 23 with nothing but the money he had saved from 4 years of working other men's cattle drives, and about the first winter in the unfinished house when the cold had been so complete it felt like a presence in the room, and about the morning in the spring of 1874 when he had stood on the rise at the eastern edge of his property and looked out over the land and felt for the first time in his life that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. She was quiet after he said that. "I have not felt that yet," she said. "That particular feeling. What does it feel like when you try to imagine it?" he said. She thought about it with the seriousness she applied to real questions. "Terrifying," she said, "and also something I very much want." He looked at her in the cold afternoon light and he thought, not for the first time, that she was one of the most interesting people he had ever sat next to. "You'll feel it," he said, "probably when you're not expecting to." She looked at him sideways. "Has anyone ever told you that you have a tendency to sound certain about things that are not certain? Has anyone ever told you that you have a tendency to challenge every comfortable thing a person says?" he said. He pressed her lips together, and this time the smile actually arrived, just briefly, just at the corner, and it changed her whole face into something that was not the careful managed composure she presented to the world, but something softer and more real and considerably more dangerous to his peace of mind. "Constantly," she said. "They usually say it like it's a criticism." "I don't," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer than she had been looking at him before. "No," she said, "you don't." The following Sunday, Laramie had a church social, the kind of gathering that in a small western town served simultaneously as religious observance, community news exchange, and informal evaluation of any newcomers. And Eliza attended it because she had decided that if she was going to consider making a life here, she needed to know the people in it. Clayton walked with her because he had always attended these things, and because he wanted to be there if anyone was unkind, not to fight her battles but to be a steady presence. He need not have worried. She handled the evaluations of the town's more pointed personalities with such serene self-possession that by the end of the afternoon, 2 of the women who had approached her with the proprietary interest of people who enjoyed knowing everyone's business had apparently decided they respected her, and a third, a sharp-tongued widow named Mrs. Garrett, had actually said to Clayton, loudly enough for most of the room to hear, that she hoped he had the sense to see what was right in front of him. He had looked at Eliza when Mrs. Garrett said it, and found her looking steadily in the other direction with the expression of someone who was not going to acknowledge having heard. He smiled. He could not help it. On the ride home from the social, she said, "Your town is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Rougher," she said. "Less community, more of the kind of lawless atmosphere that newspapers tend to describe." "We've had our rough periods," he said. "The railroad brought a certain element when it came through, and there are parts of the territory where things are considerably more volatile, but Laramie has settled some." She was quiet for a moment. "There was a man at the social," she said, "Mr. Harlan Beckett. He spoke to you and you were polite to him, but something was different in how you stood." He glanced at her. She had noticed that. "Beckett owns property south of mine," he said. "We've had disagreements about water rights. The creek that runs along the south edge of my property is where his line and mine come closest, and there have been disputes about access. It's been handled legally, but he's not a man I trust." "Are the disputes settled?" "For now," he said. She absorbed this with the practical calm of someone filing information away for future reference. "You should have told me about him before the social," she said. "I spoke with him for several minutes." "I know, I watched. And you were going to tell me about him when—" "After the social, which is now," he said. "You weren't in any danger from him in a church hall full of people, and I didn't want to color your impression before you'd formed your own." She considered this. "That is a defensible approach," she said, in the tone of someone who is giving credit where it is due while reserving the right to revisit the decision. "But in future, tell me these things." "All right," he said. "I mean it," she said. "I know you do," he said. December came to Wyoming like a hand pressed flat over everything, cold and thorough, and without apology. The snow came in the first week and stayed, and the mountains to the west disappeared behind clouds that moved slowly and did not seem interested in moving on. Eliza, who had never wintered in Wyoming, learned the specific quality of cold that came off the plains when the wind pushed it, different from eastern cold, more absolute, less forgiving, and she met it with the same practical determination she applied to most things, buying a heavier coat at the general store and learning which roads became impassable after certain amounts of snow and adjusting her movements accordingly. She had taken on some sewing work in Laramie, partly because she was not a woman who could sit idle and partly because she was not comfortable relying on Clayton's arrangement with Mrs. Porter indefinitely, and she was known quickly enough as excellent at her craft that she had more commissions than she strictly needed. This pleased her. It made her feel that she was not merely waiting, that she was building something of her own in this place regardless of what happened. She and Clayton continued their pattern of seeing each other several days a week. They took long rides on clear days when the wind let up, because he had lent her one of his horses, a steady gray mare named Prudence, who had a smooth gait and a calm temperament that Eliza appreciated without sentimentalizing. She had learned to ride competently as a girl, but had not been on horseback for years, and she came back to it faster than she expected, and she noticed Clayton noticing this, without commenting on it in the particular approving way that she was coming to recognize as his equivalent of a compliment. On a Wednesday in the middle of December, they were riding along the creek on the south edge of his property, when they came across 3 of his cattle pushed up against the fence on the Beckett side of the line, standing in the thin snow and looking unhappy about it. The fence had been pulled down in a section about 8 feet wide, and there were boot prints in the snow on the other side. Clayton dismounted and looked at the broken fence with the particular stillness of a man who is controlling his temper very deliberately. "That's Beckett," he said. "You're certain," she said. "Third time this season," he said. "Either his fence hands are incompetent or he's doing it on purpose. The cattle drift through and then he claims they're grazing on his land and he's entitled to compensation. Have you documented the previous incidents?" He looked up at her. "I keep records," he said. "But the county judge has been slow to act on complaints about Beckett. He has friends in various useful places." She sat on Prudence and looked at the broken fence and the unhappy cattle and the boot prints in the snow with the focused stillness of someone organizing information. "You need a lawyer," she said. "I have one," he said. "James Whitfield in Laramie." "Has Whitfield petitioned the territorial court?" "He's been working on it," he said. "Then he should stop working on it and actually file," she said. "The longer this continues without formal legal action, the more it looks like you've accepted the situation." "Beckett knows that." Clayton looked at her for a moment. "I know that," he said. "Whitfield is cautious. Being cautious is useful when you're waiting. When someone is actively taking advantage of your patience, caution is just delay," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said. "I usually am," she said. It was delivered without particular arrogance, more as a statement of observable fact, and there was just enough of a glint in those gray-green eyes to tell him she was also marginally teasing. He repaired the fence with the tools he kept in the saddlebag, pushing the cattle back to the correct side of the line, and driving the post back into the frozen ground with the efficiency of a man who had done it before. And Eliza held the horses and watched, and handed him things when he needed them. And there was a comfortable competence to the way they operated together in the cold that neither of them remarked upon but both of them felt. He went to see James Whitfield the following morning and told him to file. On Christmas, which was a clear and brilliant day with snow over everything, and the mountains sharp and white against a sky that was impossibly blue, Clayton came to Mrs. Porter's boarding house in the early afternoon with a paper parcel under his arm. Mrs. Porter, who had decided she approved of him, let him in with a knowing look that he pretended not to notice. Eliza came downstairs in the good green dress that he had not seen before, and he was struck again, as he sometimes was without warning, by the particular quality of her. The way she filled a room not with noise or performance, but simply with presence, with that uncompromising directness that had become as familiar to him as the landscape outside his window and considerably more interesting. He gave her the parcel. She opened it with neat, economic movements and found 2 books inside, both of them novels she had mentioned in her letters as wanting to read, but not having had access to, and a length of dark green ribbon that he had bought on impulse from the general store, because it was the color of her eyes when the light caught them at a certain angle, and he had thought she might like it even though he had been aware, buying it, that the sentiment was somewhat difficult to explain without sounding foolish. She held the ribbon and looked at it, and then looked at him. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was quieter than usual, with something in it that was not quite the managed composure she generally presented. He had gotten her a gift he thought she would actually use, and one that was perhaps slightly impractical and personal, which was a calculated honesty about how he felt about her that he had been building toward for weeks without quite having the right moment to articulate. She gave him a gift in return, which was a pair of leather gloves, very fine, with a small stamp of a horse's head worked into the cuff, and she explained with characteristic practicality that she had noticed his working gloves were worn through, and that a man who worked with his hands deserved tools that fit the work. He put them on right there, and they fit perfectly, which told him she had measured by observation and memory without asking, and he was moved by this in a way that was entirely out of proportion to the object and entirely appropriate to what it represented. They spent Christmas afternoon at his ranch house, where he had prepared a meal that was simple and honest and very good, because he had been cooking for himself for 8 years and had gotten decent at it out of necessity. And they sat at the kitchen table and ate and talked, and the lamp was warm and the fire was good, and the wind moved around the outside of the house without finding any way in. After dinner, they sat in the sitting room, and she had taken the George Eliot novel from the shelf and was reading quietly while he worked on the ranch accounts, and there was such a specific and satisfying peace to that particular evening that he sat for a while without doing the accounts at all, just aware of her in the room, of the sound of the pages turning and the fire popping and the wind outside. He looked up and found her looking at him over the top of the book. "You've stopped writing," she said. "I know," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. In the lamplight her eyes were more green than gray. "I think," she said carefully, "that I am beginning to feel it." He did not need to ask what she meant. "The terrifying thing," he said. "Yes," she said, "that one." He put down his pen. "What does it feel like?" he said. She thought about it with her usual seriousness. "Like standing at the edge of something very large and discovering that I am not as afraid of it as I expected to be," she said, "which is itself slightly alarming." He looked at her across the room, in the lamplight, with the fire warming the room and the snow outside and the books on the shelf and the 2 cups of coffee on the table between them. "Eliza," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without the prefix, and they both noticed it. "Clayton," she said, equally quietly, and there was something in the way she said it that was different from the careful neutrality she had held onto through these weeks, something warmer and more deliberate, a door that was choosing to open. He stood up and crossed the room, and she watched him come the way she had watched him on the train platform, directly and without retreat, and he sat beside her on the small settee, and he took her hand very carefully, giving her all the time in the world to move it away, and she did not move it away. Her hand in his was cool and competent, the hand of a woman who worked and read and made things, and she looked down at their joined hands with the expression of someone confirming that a thing they had expected to be frightening was in fact something else entirely. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I know," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. She lifted her eyes from their hands to his face. "I have conditions," she said. "All right," he said. I want to continue the sewing work for as long as I choose to, she said. I will not give it up because it is inconvenient or because a wife is not supposed to work outside the home. I want it to be understood that this is my choice and not a subject of ongoing discussion. Understood, he said. I want to be consulted on the decisions that affect both of us, she said. Not informed after the fact, consulted. I would not have it any other way, he said. And I want the second rocking chair, she said. The one that appeared in the sitting room sometime in the last month and has been sitting there as though it has always been there. He had forgotten he had moved it inside. It was always there, he said, without changing his expression. It absolutely was not, she said. He was quiet for a moment. It's yours, he said. She looked at him steadily. Yes, she said. I will marry you. He felt the answer move through him like the first warm day after a long winter, the kind of warmth that makes you realize how long you have been cold. He brought her hand to his lips with the same care he applied to everything he meant, and she watched him do it with those eyes that did not soften into prettiness, but held instead a clear and honest and very specific kind of warmth that he was beginning to understand was more valuable than any easy softness, because it was real. They married in the second week of January, 1879, in the small white church on Laramie's Main Street, on a day when the sky was the pale, sharp blue of deep winter, and the snow had been cleared from the church steps, and the inside smelled of beeswax candles and the dry wood of the pews. Mrs. Porter was there, and Theodore Greer and his wife, and Dr. Hale and Mrs. Garrett from the church social, who had apparently decided to adopt a proprietary interest in the whole affair, and Denny Alcott in his best shirt with his hair combed flat, and a handful of other townspeople who had come to know Eliza over her 2 months in Laramie, and had formed the opinion that she was exactly the kind of woman this particular man needed. Eliza wore the navy blue coat over a white dress she had made herself, because she was not a woman who left things she could do herself to someone else, and she had stitched a narrow line of cream-colored lace at the collar that was her single concession to ornamentation, and was, in Clayton's view, absolutely perfect in the way that small and true things tend to be. She came down the aisle of that small church with her head up and her eyes forward, and she looked at him the whole way, not away from him or at her hands or at the floor, but at him, with that direct and uncompromising gaze that had undone him from the very first letter. And he stood there at the front of the church and met her gaze, and felt that he was the most fortunate man in the Wyoming territory, which was not a small thing to feel in a territory that size. The minister was a gentle and slightly harried man named Reverend Collins, who performed the ceremony with appropriate solemnity, and Clayton thought, a certain visible relief that neither of them was the nervous type who forgot their words or went pale at the altar. They said the words that needed to be said, and she said them clearly and without hesitation, and he said them with the same quiet certainty he brought to anything he had decided was true. When the Reverend pronounced them married, he kissed her once, briefly and with complete intention, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, and Mrs. Garrett made an audible sound of satisfaction from the third pew that set off a ripple of warm laughter through the small congregation. They went back to the ranch that evening and the house was theirs together, and she moved through it without apology, rearranging 2 things in the kitchen that she felt would be more practical in different positions, and hanging her coat on the peg nearest the door. And he watched her do these things, and felt the house become a home in a way it had not been before, felt the particular rightness of it, the thing he had not been able to name until it arrived. She sat down in the second rocking chair by the fire. He sat down in the first. She picked up the George Eliot novel from the side table where she had left it. He picked up the ranch accounts. Outside, the Wyoming winter lay over everything, cold and complete and indifferent. Inside, the fire was warm and the lamp was bright, and she was here. That was the beginning. Spring came to the Laramie Plains in the particular sudden way of high Wyoming, almost reluctant, and then all at once, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes and the creek running high with melt, and the first tentative green coming up in the pastures in mid-April. Eliza found that she had been right about the feeling she had told him she was beginning to feel in December. It came fully in the spring, in an unremarkable moment when she was standing at the kitchen window in the early morning, watching the light come over the mountains, and she realized without fanfare or ceremony that she did not want to be anywhere else on the earth. It was a quiet revelation, the kind that does not arrive with drama because it has already been building for long enough that by the time you notice it, it is not arriving at all but simply there, solid and established, like a fence post that has been set long enough to feel permanent. She told Clayton about it that evening, in the same straightforward way she told him most things. "I've stopped being afraid of it," she said. He looked up from the harness he was mending by the firelight. "The terrifying thing," he said. "Yes," she said. "It stopped being terrifying, I'm not entirely sure when." He set the harness down and looked at her in the lamplight. "Good," he said. She looked at him with slight amusement. "That's all you have to say." "I've been waiting for it since December," he said. "Good seems like the right word." She shook her head, but she was smiling, and he had come to understand that her smiles were more meaningful than other people's, because they were never offered as performance, only as truth. That spring brought other things along with the wildflowers and the good grass for the cattle. It brought the resolution of the Becket dispute, which came in March when James Whitfield's formal petition to the territorial court resulted in a ruling that required Becket to restore the damaged fence sections and pay for 2 seasons' worth of demonstrated losses due to the incidents of deliberate boundary disruption. Clayton had taken Eliza to the court proceeding in Cheyenne, partly because she had been the one who told him to push Whitfield toward action, and partly because she deserved to see the resolution of a thing she had helped bring about. Becket had given Clayton a long and unfriendly look across the courtroom afterward, and Eliza had stepped up beside Clayton and given Becket a look in return that was so composed and unintimidated that the older man had looked away first. And Clayton had felt, in that moment, the particular satisfaction of standing next to someone who made you stronger not by fighting for you but by being entirely, fearlessly themselves beside you. On the ride back from Cheyenne, she said, "He'll try something else eventually." "Probably," Clayton said. "Then we'll deal with that too," she said. "Yes," he said, "we will." Summer came in full, and the ranch work expanded to fill the long days. And Eliza was present in all of it, not doing the heavy physical labor of the cattle operation, but managing the kitchen garden with methodical skill, handling the household accounts with a precision that saved them money without sacrificing anything of substance, maintaining her sewing work in town, which had grown into a small but steady business. She had taken on an apprentice in June, a 16-year-old girl named Rosie Alcott who happened to be Denny's younger sister and who had genuine talent with a needle, and whom Eliza taught with patient seriousness, not because she had been asked to, but because she recognized the girl's ability and believed it deserved proper cultivation. Denny, who thought the world of his sister, became even more devoted to the ranch as a result, which Eliza had not intended and found quietly amusing. She and Clayton rode together most mornings when the work permitted, taking Conductor and Prudence out along the creek or up toward the higher pastures where you could see farther than seemed possible. And these rides had become the part of the day that both of them protected without saying so, the part that was theirs in a way that was different from everything else. On a morning in late July, they had ridden up to the Eastern Rise, the place where Clayton had stood in the spring of 1874, and felt for the first time that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And they sat their horses side by side and looked out over the green-gold sweep of the land in the summer light. "I can see why," she said. He glanced at her. "You told me about standing here in 1874, she said. "I can see why." He looked at the land he had built his life on, and he looked at her beside him on the gray mare with her dark hair loose for once in the morning heat and her coat tied behind the saddle, and he thought that the view from this rise had changed since then, had gained something it had not had gained a center, someone to see it with. "Eliza," he said. She looked at him with those clear gray-green eyes. "I love you," he said. He had not said it before in those exact words, though he had been saying it in other ways for months, and he said it now plainly because it was true, and he was not a man who withheld true things. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she said it back. "I love you," she said, with the same straightforwardness she brought to every real thing. And it was not a tentative or confused or conditional statement, but a clean and uncomplicated truth delivered by a woman who had decided it was true, and was not interested in softening it with hedges. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat on the rise in the July morning with the wind moving through the grass below them and the mountains at their backs, and neither of them spoke for a while, because there was nothing that needed adding to what had just been said. She was with child by October, which they discovered with a mix of emotions that Eliza processed with her characteristic thoroughness, moving through uncertainty and logistical concern, and finally arriving at a quiet happiness that she described to him one evening as feeling like the land did in early spring, uncertain and then suddenly certain, all at once. He was overwhelmed in a way that he managed by going very still and saying very little, which she had learned was how he processed things that moved him most deeply. And she let him have his stillness, and sat with him through it in the comfortable way of a woman who understood the man beside her. Dr. Hale confirmed the news in October with his usual matter-of-fact competence, and told Eliza she was in excellent health, and that the child would come in the spring, in April or May, he estimated, and she should not change her habits dramatically because women in good health who kept up their activity generally fared better than those who were confined to rest unnecessarily. She found this medically reasonable and was grateful for a doctor who said so. She told Clayton what Dr. Hale had said, and he nodded with the expression of a man who was going to spend the entire winter being carefully not overprotective, while also being somewhat overprotective in ways that were subtle enough to be plausibly deniable. She told him, as gently as she was capable of telling anyone anything, which was directly, that she was going to continue writing and working and taking on sewing commissions, and that she was not made of glass. And he said he knew that, and she said as long as they understood each other, and he said they did, and they did. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was one of the harder ones in Wyoming, with early snow in October and sustained cold through February that tested the cattle operation and kept the roads difficult for long stretches. Clayton and Eliza and Denny worked the winter cattle care together, and she learned the rhythms of it, the early morning checks and the evening feeding, and the constant calculation of hay supply against days remaining in the season. And she took to the knowledge with the same methodical appetite she brought to everything worth understanding. Theodore Greer came over in January with his wife Clara, and they had supper together by the fire. And Clara, who was warm and practical and had 3 children of her own, and had lived in Wyoming for 12 years, told Eliza things about the spring that were useful and not alarming, delivered in the tone of someone who respected the other woman's competence. Eliza liked Clara very much. She found that she was building a life here not just with Clayton but around him, finding her own people in this place. Mrs. Porter and Dr. Hale and Clara Greer and young Rosie Alcott, who was getting very good with a needle, and even Mrs. Garrett, who had a sharp tongue and a genuinely good heart, and who brought a pot of soup to the ranch house in February without explanation, and simply left it on the porch. The baby arrived on the 23rd of April, 1880, in the bedroom of the ranch house with Dr. Hale attending, and Clara Greer present as a steady and capable additional set of hands, while Clayton sat in the kitchen and demonstrated that the man who was unshakable in most circumstances had discovered the outer limit of his composure. It was a boy. He came into the world loud and emphatic, which Eliza, lying back against the pillows with the work done and the child in her arms, found deeply appropriate. "Doctor." Hale came out to the kitchen and told Clayton, and he stood up from the kitchen chair and stayed standing very still for a moment before following the doctor back down the hall. She looked up when he came through the door, and her face was tired in a way he had never seen before, a deep and specific tiredness, but her eyes were clear and warm and held that private expression she kept for him, the one that had taken months to emerge and that he valued more than anything he owned. He crossed to her side and sat carefully on the edge of the bed. The baby in her arms was red-faced and furiously alive, small fists clenched, dark hair plastered flat, in every way a new and astonishing thing. "He's angry," Clayton said. "He's just arrived," Eliza said. "He has a right to opinions about it." Clayton looked at his son with the feeling of a man standing at the edge of something vast, the same feeling she had described on that December evening, terrifying and wanted in equal measure. He put out one finger, and the baby's fist, encountering it, grabbed on with a grip that was entirely out of proportion to his size. Clayton was undone. He sat there with his son's fist around his finger, and his wife watching him with those clear and knowing eyes, and something happened to the careful stillness he kept around himself, happened to the deliberate management of feeling that he had developed over years of solitary work, and he did not try to manage it. He let it happen, let it be what it was, which was enormous and good and right. "What do you want to name him?" he said when he could speak properly. "I thought about Thomas," she said. "After my father." Clayton considered this. "Thomas William Maddox," he said. The William was his father's name. He had not mentioned it as a suggestion, only spoken it to hear how it sounded. She looked at him for a moment. "Thomas William," she said. "Yes, that's right." Thomas William Maddox was, from the very first days of his life, a person of considerable character, which was to say that he was loud and demanding and very clear about his preferences, and had his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and as far as could be determined from a very small person, his parents shared tendency toward forming opinions and keeping them. He grew the way children do, in the particular Wyoming way where the seasons mark everything, and his first year went from the late spring of his birth through the summer and fall and into the second winter, and he sat up and pulled himself to standing and spoke his first words in the kitchen of the ranch house with the mountains outside the window and the fire going and both his parents present, and his first word was a firm and unmistakable no, which made Eliza laugh with a fullness that was the most unguarded Clayton had ever heard from her, and which he would remember for the rest of his life. The ranch grew in those years. Clayton added 60 more acres on the northern boundary, through a purchase that he and Eliza had discussed for 6 months before they agreed it made financial sense. And with the additional land came additional cattle and an additional ranch hand, a quiet and competent man named Ezra Webb who had come up from Texas looking for steadier work, and who turned out to be worth every cent of his wages. Eliza's sewing work had by 1882 become something more organized than a simple home business, because Rosie Alcott had become genuinely excellent, and between the two of them, they had more work than they could manage individually, and had begun coordinating with the general store to sell finished goods alongside the custom orders. Eliza had also, quietly and without making much of it, started lending books to women in the area who could not afford to buy them, which had turned into a kind of informal lending arrangement that Dr. Hale had taken to calling, with affection, the Maddox Library, a name Eliza found excessive but did not object to strenuously. Thomas learned to ride at 4, as children did in Wyoming, on a gentle old mare that had been put to lighter work as she aged, and he learned with the same fierce focus he brought to everything, which was a quality both his parents recognized, and neither was sure which of them he had gotten it from, though the answer was obvious. On the evening of Thomas's 4th birthday, which they celebrated with a cake Clara Greer had taught Eliza to make in the particular moist style that required considerable amounts of molasses and effort, Eliza sat with Clayton on the porch in the warm May evening after Thomas had been put to bed. "There's something I want to tell you," she said. He looked at her with the attentiveness he had always given her. "We are going to need the second room upstairs to stop being a storeroom," she said. He was quiet for a moment. When he said, "December," she said. "Dr. Hale says December." He looked at her in the May evening light, with the warm air and the sound of the cattle settling and Thomas asleep upstairs in the room with the quilt that Eliza had made him the first winter, and he felt again that enormous and wordless thing. "Are you happy?" he asked. She turned to look at him with those eyes. "Extraordinarily," she said. He reached over and took her hand on the arm of the rocking chair, and she turned her hand over and held his properly, and they sat in the evening and listened to the land. The second child was born in December 1884, in a snowstorm that would have been inconvenient if Dr. Hale had not already been staying at the ranch in anticipation of exactly this circumstance, because Eliza had looked at the weather patterns in November and determined that December was going to be complicated and had arranged accordingly. It was a practical decision that Dr. Hale had appreciated and that Clayton had been quietly relieved by without saying so. This one was a girl. She came in the same emphatic way as Thomas, as though arriving were a thing to be done thoroughly and without delay, and she was placed in Eliza's arms while the storm moved around the house and the lamp burned steadily in the bedroom. Thomas was asleep in his room, having been told with considerable seriousness that the new baby was arriving, and that this was a good thing, and that he would meet her in the morning. And he had accepted this information with the cautious interest of a child who was not entirely sure whether a new person in the house represented an improvement or an inconvenience. In the morning he stood in the bedroom doorway and looked at the bundle in his mother's arms with a 4-year-old's careful evaluation. "She's very small," he said. "You were also very small," Eliza told him. "I don't remember that," he said, which was logical. "Her name is Margaret," Eliza said. Thomas considered this. "Can I touch her hand?" he said. "Carefully," Eliza said, and he crossed the room with the particular gravity of a child being trusted with something important and touched his sister's fingers with one careful fingertip, and she curled her fingers against his touch the way babies do, and Thomas looked up at his parents with an expression that was transparently delighted despite his best efforts at continued evaluation. "She grabbed me," he said. "She likes you," Clayton said. Thomas looked at his sister with the expression of a person who has just decided something. From that morning forward, he was devoted to Margaret in the fierce and undemonstrative way that was recognizable in the Maddox family as the deepest kind of caring. The years that followed were full ones. They were the years that built themselves into a life in the way that years do when the foundation beneath them is solid, each one adding something to what was already there, deepening it, widening it, making it more completely itself. Clayton and Eliza were not perfect in any of it. They had their arguments, which were vigorous and honest and conducted between two people who both had strong opinions and would not be managed or talked past, and which generally ended with one or both of them having changed their thinking in some respect, because they were both constitutionally incapable of maintaining a position they had privately concluded was wrong just to avoid losing the argument. They had their difficulties. The drought of 1886 was hard on the cattle operation, and they made decisions together that were difficult and cost them money in the short term and proved correct in the long term, and Eliza's clear-eyed management of their finances through that year was the difference between weathering the drought and being broken by it. Clayton knew this and told her so, because he was not a man who withheld true things. She told him, during the hardest part of that year when the creek ran low and the pastures went brown and the losses mounted, that she was not afraid, that she had been afraid of less consequential things and had survived them, and that as long as they were making decisions together, she was confident they would find the right way through. He believed her, because she had never told him something was true that was not true. Beckett sold his property in 1887 and moved on, which brought a relief to the southern boundary that felt like a door finally closing on a long-standing draft. The man who bought the Beckett land was a quiet farmer from Ohio named Pierce who had no interest in water rights disputes and good fences and a neighborly disposition. And the first time Eliza met Mrs. Pierce, she recognized in the woman's precise and competent manner someone she was going to get along with, which she did, immediately and thoroughly. Thomas at 7 was all energy and determination, and the kind of questions that required actual answers, not deflection, because he could tell the difference and had no patience for the latter. He helped with the cattle work on weekends with a seriousness that made Denny Alcott, who was now 26 and effectively the foreman of the operation, treat him with genuine respect, which Thomas found deeply satisfying in the way that children do when they are taken seriously by adults they admire. Margaret at 3 was a creature of profound opinions and enormous charm, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and a laugh that filled whatever room she was in, and she followed Eliza everywhere with the attentiveness of a person who has identified the most interesting individual in their world, and intends to learn everything from them. Eliza taught her daughter to read at 4, in the kitchen of the ranch house with the morning light coming through the window, using the same method her father had used with her, patiently and without condescension, treating the learning as something worthy of seriousness. Clayton watched this from the doorway one morning without announcing himself, watched his wife at the kitchen table with their daughter, the way Eliza's finger moved along the printed page and Margaret's eyes followed it, and the moment when the child's face changed as a word resolved itself into meaning, and he thought about the letters, about the first one, Mrs. Hartwell's careful descriptions, proud and difficult, as though those were warnings rather than what they actually were, which was a description of a woman who would not be diminished and would not pretend and would not settle, and who had been waiting for someone who recognized the value of those things. He thought about saddling conductor before he had finished reading the letter, and how that impulse had been the most accurate thing he had ever done. In 1889, Wyoming achieved statehood, and the territory became the 44th state of the Union on July 10th, and in Laramie there was a celebration of considerable civic enthusiasm, and Clayton and Eliza attended it together with Thomas at 9 and Margaret at 4, and Thomas was old enough to understand what statehood meant, and asked clarifying questions throughout the ceremony that were good questions, specific and practical, and Eliza answered all of them precisely and completely. Margaret, who was 4 and had strong feelings about crowds, sat on her father's shoulders for most of the event and watched the proceedings from her elevated position with the composure of someone who had arranged to have the best view and was satisfied with it. It was a good day. The town of Laramie threw a grand social that evening, and the Maddoxes were there for all of it, and Clayton danced with Eliza to the music of a fiddle and a man with a mouth organ, not beautifully but with good intentions and genuine enjoyment, and she danced back with him with the particular smile she gave when she was happy and not managing it, and Mrs. Garrett, who was older now and moved more slowly but had lost none of her sharp and accurate perception, watched them from her chair, and said to Mrs. Porter beside her that she had never been wrong about those two. Mrs. Porter, who had watched the whole thing from the delivery of Eliza to her boarding house in November of 1878, agreed with the warmth of someone who was proud of her small part in it. That fall, on an October evening when the aspens on the mountain slopes were the particular burning gold of Wyoming in autumn, and the air smelled of cold coming, and the ranch work was shifting into the rhythms of the approaching winter, Clayton and Eliza sat together on the porch as they had sat on many evenings over 11 years of marriage, in their rocking chairs with the view in front of them. And they were quiet together in the way of people who have been talking for so long that silence between them is as comfortable as speech. Thomas was inside doing his schoolwork with the lamp on, and the characteristic determined frown he brought to anything he found difficult. Margaret had fallen asleep on the settee an hour ago with a picture book open on her chest, which was where Clayton had found her and had left her for the time being because she looked too peaceful to disturb. Eliza had a quilt over her lap against the October cold and a cup of tea in both hands and was watching the mountains change color in the fading light. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" he said. "About the letters," she said. He glanced at her. "The letters we wrote," she said, "before I came." "What about them?" She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about what it took," she said, "for me to write back to that first one. I had written back to 3 men before you. And every one of those correspondences had ended badly, for various reasons, and I was beginning to think that the problem was the entire concept. That the idea of corresponding with a stranger and then traveling to marry him was simply a system that could not work, regardless of the intentions involved." He waited. "And then your letter arrived," she said, "and I read it 3 times. And I couldn't explain to myself exactly why it was different except that it was, and I decided to take the risk again." She looked at him. "I am very glad I did." He looked back at her in the October evening light. "I didn't finish reading Mrs. Hartwell's letter," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "When I got to the part that said you were proud and difficult," he said, "I set it down and went to the barn and saddled conductor. To go to the telegraph office," she said. "To send word to the agency that I wanted to write to you directly," he said. She stared at him. "You saddled your horse before you finished reading the letter," she said. "I'd read what I needed to," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "That is either very impulsive or very certain," she said. "It was certain," he said. "You had never met me," she said. "I know. You knew almost nothing about me. I knew you were proud and had convictions and that 3 men had called that difficult," he said. "And I knew that told me more about those 3 men than it told me about you." She looked at him for a long moment with those gray-green eyes that had looked at him with 100 different things over 11 years. Wariness and curiosity and challenge and warmth and love and exasperation and amusement, and the specific intimate knowledge of someone who has been beside you through enough seasons to know exactly who you are. "You absolute contrary man," she said, softly and with complete affection. "You knew that before you married me," he said. "I did," she said. "I chose it anyway." He reached over and took her hand on the arm of her rocking chair, the same way he had taken it on the first evening they had sat on this porch, and she turned her hand over and held his, the same way she had then. The mountains were going purple in the failing light, and the aspens were burning gold, and the stars were beginning to appear in the east, sharp and clean as they were in Wyoming, where the sky was broad enough to hold all of them. Inside the house, Thomas looked up from his schoolwork and listened to the silence from the porch, the particular silence that was not empty but full, and went back to his sums with the comfort of a child who knows, without having to think about it, that the world outside this house is large and sometimes difficult, but that the world inside it is steady. Margaret slept on the settee with the picture book rising and falling on her chest. The fire in the hearth burned down to coals, and the lamp burned on. Outside, the October night settled over the Wyoming plains, over the ranch that was theirs, over the land they had built a life on together, over the years and the letters and the cold train platform, and the first uncertain morning when she had stood in his kitchen and looked at the window over the sink and begun to imagine. Eliza Maddox sat on her porch in the last of the evening light with her husband's hand in hers, and felt what she had felt that morning in the spring of 1880, standing at the kitchen window, watching the light come over the mountains, what she had known in that quiet, unremarkable moment that had not needed drama to be complete. That she did not want to be anywhere else on the earth. The feeling had not changed in 11 years. It had only deepened, the way the land deepened in meaning the longer you worked it, the way a well-used book became more itself the more it was read, the way a house became a home by accumulation of all the small and real things that had happened in it. She was proud. She had always been proud, and she had never pretended otherwise, and she had married a man who had read 1 sentence about that and saddled his horse, and she thought, not for the first time, that love in its truest form was not the softening of the things that made you yourself, but the finding of the person who had been looking for exactly those things. She looked out at the mountains going dark against the sky. "Come spring," she said, "I think we should extend the northern pasture fence another quarter-mile. The grazing has been better up there since the drought years, and with the additional cattle we brought on in August, we're going to need the room." He was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "Good," she said. "We can go over the figures this week." "All right," he said. They sat in the last light, her hand in his, the children behind them in the warm house, the land spread out before them under the emerging stars. It was, in every way that mattered, exactly where they were both supposed to be. Years later, Thomas Maddox, grown by then into a serious and decent young man who had taken up a portion of the ranch work with the same meticulous commitment his parents had built the place on, would tell people who asked that his parents had been, in his estimation, the best possible argument for the idea that two very particular people, placed in proximity with honesty between them, could build something that lasted. He would say this with the directness he had gotten from his mother and the certainty he had gotten from his father, and people who heard him say it generally found it convincing, because he said it the way true things are said, without flourish, as plain statement. Margaret, who had her mother's eyes and her mother's refusal to be anything but completely herself, would eventually become one of the first women in Laramie County to be formally recognized for her work as a teacher, establishing a small school in the county's eastern district, where families lived too far from the town center to send their children to the main school. She had learned this from her mother, who had lent books to people who could not afford them, and had believed quietly and practically that the ability to read was not a luxury but a right, and had acted on this belief without making speeches about it. Eliza was 53 when Margaret opened the school, and she rode out with Clayton on a clear November morning to see it, the same month of year when she had first stepped off the westbound train in Laramie 27 years before, and she stood outside the small building in the November cold and looked at the sign above the door that bore her daughter's name, and she felt something that was not pride exactly but was adjacent to it. Was the specific and deep feeling of looking at something you had helped make possible simply by being who you were. Clayton stood beside her and said nothing, because he did not need to. She took his hand. They rode home together in the November cold, the same road they had ridden many times, with the mountains ahead of them going white with the new season snow, and the sky very clear and very blue, and the land on either side of them familiar, and beloved in the way that only the places you have worked and worried over and celebrated and struggled for can be. The way that has nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with belonging. The ranch house stood at the end of the drive as it had always stood, solid and lit from within, with smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, and the two rocking chairs on the porch empty in the cold. They put the horses up together in the barn, working side by side in the easy and coordinated way of two people who have been doing a thing together for long enough that they no longer need to speak about who does which part. And then they walked to the house through the cold air and went inside where the fire was going, and the kitchen smelled of the dinner that had been left warming on the stove by the young woman who came in twice a week to help now that the children were grown. They ate together at the kitchen table as they had eaten together for 27 years, and they talked and were quiet and talked again. And afterward she read in the sitting room in the rocking chair that had been hers since before she could remember it not being hers, and he sat across from her with his accounts or his own book or simply with his coffee and his thoughts. And the fire burned and the lamp burned, and outside the Wyoming night pressed its cold forehead against the windows and found nothing inside it could diminish. It was enough. It was considerably more than enough. It was the whole of the thing, built from 2 letters and a saddled horse, and a decision made before all the information was in, which was how the best decisions tended to get made, not from the full picture but from the essential thing, the thing that told you before you could explain why that you needed to move, to go, to reach toward the person on the other side of the distance, and say, here I am, and I am not afraid of what they told me about you. I am here because of it, and I believe you are worth the ride. She had been worth every mile. He would have told anyone who asked, and he had told several people over the years who had observed them together and wanted to know the secret of it, that there was no secret, only this, that he had read one true thing about her and recognized it, and that he had been fortunate enough not to talk himself out of what he recognized. She would have told those same people, in her own way, that she had made herself read his first letter 3 times in the boarding house in Abilene, and had paid attention to what that meant, and that she had spent her life being glad she had. They were sitting in their chairs on a Sunday afternoon in late November, the anniversary month of her arrival in Laramie, when she looked up from her book and said, in the same tone she had used on that first December evening 11 years into what she had not yet known would be her life, the tone that came out when something was true and she had decided to say it plainly. I would do it all again. He looked up. Every letter, she said. Every mile. Every uncertain morning in Mrs. Porter's boarding house wondering if I had made a profound mistake. I would do it all again. He looked at her across the room, across the years, across all the seasons they had sat in these chairs and worked this land and raised those children and fought their arguments and made their decisions and held each other through the hard years and celebrated the good ones. And he felt the same thing he had felt on the train platform when she had walked toward him with her traveling bag in her hand and her chin up and her eyes direct. The same thing he had felt when she had said yes in this house on a Christmas evening with her hand in his. The same thing that had made him set down an unfinished letter and go to the barn. So would I, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she smiled, and it was the smile that was not managed or performed but simply real, the one that had taken months to appear and had never once stopped being extraordinary. She went back to her book. He went back to his accounts. Outside, the Wyoming winter settled over the land with its cold and total completeness. And inside the fire burned on, and the lamp burned on, and they were there together, exactly where they were supposed to be, and that was the whole of it, and it was more than enough, and it was theirs.